Now, it is interesting to notice that the extreme pessimist and the extreme optimist agree on at least one point. They both feel that we must sit down and do nothing in the area of race relations. The extreme optimist says do nothing because integration is inevitable. The extreme pessimist says do nothing because integration is impossible. But there is a third attitude that can be taken, namely the realistic position. The realist in this area seeks to combine the truths of two opposites while avoiding the extremes of both. And so the realist would agree with the optimist that we have come a long, long way in grappling with this problem. But he would balance that by agreeing with the pessimist that we have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved in the United States. And it is this realistic position that I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together as we think of progress and as we think of the future of integration.
Now let us notice that we have come a long, long way. And I think I should say first at this point that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in reevaluating his own intrinsic worth. In order to prove this contention, a little history is necessary. You will remember that it was in the year 1619 that the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of this great nation. They were brought here from the shores of Africa, and unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here against their will. Throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhumane fashion, and he was a thing that was used, not a person to be respected. He was little more than a depersonalized cog in a vast plantation machine. The famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 well illustrated the status of the Negro during slavery. For in this decision, the Supreme Court of the nation said that the Negro was not a citizen of the United States. He was merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. With the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. It seemed to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe the obvious wrongs in this beautiful garments of righteousness. The philosopher-psychologist William James used to talk a great deal about this stream of consciousness. He says that the very interesting and unique thing about human nature is that man had the capacity temporarily to block the stream of consciousness and place anything in it that he wants to. And so we often end up justifying the rightness of the wrong. This is exactly what happened during the days of slavery.
Living with the conditions of slavery and the later segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that perhaps they were less than human, but then something happened to the Negro. Circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. Even his economic life was rising through the growth of industry, the influence of organized labor, expanding educational opportunities, and even his cultural life was rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. All of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves, and the Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children, and that all men are made in his image, and that the basic thing about a man is not his specificity, but his fundamentum. Not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his internal dignity and worth. And so the Negro could now unconsciously cry out with the eloquent poet, "Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And were I so tall as to reach the pole, or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man, and with this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to struggle, suffer, and sacrifice in order to be free. So in a real sense, we've come a long, long way since 1619.
But probably more than anything else, we have seen the walls of racial segregation gradually crumble. We all know the legal history of the system of segregation. It had its beginnings in 1896 when the Supreme Court rendered a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which established the doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land. Of course, there was always a strict enforcement of the separate without the slightest intention to abide by the equal. As a result of the Plessy doctrine, Negroes ended up being plunged into the abyss of exploitation, where they experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. Then something else happened. In May of 1954, the Supreme Court of the nation examined the legal body of segregation and pronounced it constitutionally dead. It said, in substance, that the old Plessy doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, that to segregate a child on the basis of their race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. We've seen many developments since that decision was rendered. To put it figuratively and in biblical language, we've broken loose from the Egypt of slavery, and we have moved through the wilderness of racial segregation, and now we stand at the border of the promised land of integration. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that the system of segregation is on its deathbed today, and the only thing uncertain about it is how costly the South will make the funeral. This reveals that we've come a long, long way since 1896.
Now, this would be a wonderful place for me to end my speech. Number one, it would mean making a short speech, and that would be a magnificent accomplishment for a Baptist preacher. Second, it would mean that the problem is about solved, and it would be a marvelous thing for every speaker in our nation to get up and talk about the problem in terms of a problem that once existed, and that is now solved. But if I stopped at this point, I would be merely stating a fact and not telling the truth. You see, a fact is merely the absence of a contradiction, but truth is the presence of coherence. Truth is the relatedness of facts. Now it is a fact that we've come a long, long way, but it isn't the whole truth. In order to tell the truth, it would be necessary to add the other part, and I'm afraid that if I stopped at this point, I would leave you the victims of a dangerous optimism. If I stopped here, I would leave you the victims of an illustration wrapped in superficialities. So in order to tell the truth, it is necessary to move on and not only say that we've come a long, long way, but that we've a long, long way to go before the American dream is a reality, before this problem is solved.
Now, we do not have to look very far to see this. It is one of the strange ironies of history that in a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal, men are still arguing over whether the color of a man's skin determines the content of his character. It is one of the tragedies of history that in a nation founded on the principle that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that it takes 12,000 troops to make it possible for one Negro to go to a university supported by the tax money of that particular state. This reveals that we have a long, long way to go. The legislative halls of some states ring loud with such words as interposition and nullification.
When an individual is deprived of economic necessities, that individual cannot educate his children. That individual cannot have livable housing conditions. That individual cannot have proper health facilities. And it can lead to many, many social problems. It is so easy for one to say that the Negro has lagging standards. Occasionally we hear this, that the Negro is a criminal. And these are the problems that must be solved. And if there are lagging standards, they are here because of discrimination, because of economic deprivation, and social isolation. These things are not racial, they are environmental. And poverty and ignorance breed crime, whatever the racial group may be. And it is torturous logic to use the tragic results of segregation and discrimination as an argument for the continuation of them. It is necessary to move back to the cause and source. And so, in the era of economic progress, we have a great deal of work to do.
If this problem is to be solved, if we are to go this additional distance, many forces and many agencies must work together. The forces of goodwill must be mobilized in order to go the additional distance and make integration and the brotherhood of man a reality. First, the federal government must use all of its constitutional authority to enforce the law of the land. As we look back over the years, we must honestly admit that only one branch of the government has given consistent, forthright, vigorous leadership, namely the judicial branch of the government. But the executive and legislative branches of the government have been all too apathetic, all too silent, and sometimes hypocritical. The time has come for all of the branches of the federal government to work in a vigorous manner to make integration a reality.
Now, if the federal government is to do its job, we must get rid of two myths that tend to circulate and get around in our society. One is the myth of time. You have heard this. The federal government cannot solve this problem, according to the people who hold with this myth, because only time can solve this problem. They would go on to say that if the individuals who are struggling now, the individuals who are victims of oppression will just be patient and wait 100 or 2 years, time will solve this problem. This is a myth that is circulated over and over again. There is only one answer to it, it seems to me, and that is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm convinced that in many points, the people of ill will in the United States have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. Something must come to remind us that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Evolution may be true in the biological realm. At that point, Darwin is right. But when a Herbert Spencer seeks to apply it to the whole of society, there is very little evidence for it. Human progress comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. Without this hard work, time itself becomes the ally of the primitive forces of irrational emotionalism and social stagnation. And so we must help time and realize that the time is always ripe to do right.
There is another myth that has circulated a great deal. I call it, for lack of a better phrase, the myth of educational determinism. I am sure you have heard this. Legislation can't solve this problem. Only education can solve it. Judicial decrees can't solve it. Executive orders from the president can't solve it. Only with education and changing attitudes through education will we be able to come to a solution to this problem. Now, there is a partial truth here, for education does have a great role to play in this period of transition. But it is not either education or legislation. It is both education and legislation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. And this is what we often say we have to do in society through legislation.
I'm convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. I rush on to say that religious bodies over this country must play a role, and a significant role, if we are to go this additional distance. And there are those who are willing to stand up, and I believe that as a church takes a stand and continues to take a stand, the transition from a segregated to a desegregated and finally an integrated society will be much smoother.
Now, there is a great deal that can be said about this method, and I would like to say just a few things as I move toward my conclusion. First, it has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses. It weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience, and so he just doesn't know how to deal with it. If he doesn't beat you, that's wonderful. If he beats you, you develop the power of accepting blows without retaliating. If he doesn't put you in jail, wonderful. Nobody with any sense wants to go to jail. If he puts you in jail, you willingly go in there and transform the jail from a dungeon of shame to a haven of human freedom and dignity. Even if he tries to kill you, you develop the quiet courage of dying, if necessary, without killing. And he just doesn't know how to handle it. It leaves an opponent frustrated and disarmed, and he is finally glutted with his own barbarity. This is the power of nonviolence. But not only that, it has great moral attributes in that it makes it possible for the individual to struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. One of the great philosophical debates of the centuries has been over the whole question of ends and means. There have been those individuals from Machiavelli on down who argued that the end justifies the means. Sometimes systems of government have followed this theory. Listen to Lenin as he says, lying, deceit, violence, concealing and withholding the truth are all justifiable means to bring about the end of the classless society.
This is the great weakness and tragedy of communism and any other system that argues the end justifies the means. For in a real sense, the end is pre-existent in the means. The means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. In the long run of history, immoral means cannot bring about moral ends. Destructive means cannot bring about constructive goals. The beauty of nonviolence is that it makes it possible for the individual to struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. Another thing about it is that it makes it possible for the individual to apply the love ethic in the struggle for freedom and justice. It makes it possible for the individual to place love at the center of his life and thereby transform a social situation. This is the beauty of nonviolence, because hate is always injurious. It is as injurious to the hater as it is to the hated. Psychiatrists are telling us now of many of the strange things that have happened in the subconscious. Many of the inner conflicts are rooted in hate, and so they are saying now, love or perish. And the beauty of nonviolence is that it is possible to fight war without violence, and it is possible to struggle for that which is right with love in one's heart.
Now, when I talk about love, I am not talking about emotional bosh. I am not talking about some weak, sentimental something. I'm talking about something strong and powerful. I'm talking about something that is active goodwill, not just a passive dead something. People always raise the question, how can you love those who are oppressing you, those who are seeking to defeat you, those who are trampling over you with the iron feet of oppression? How can you love such people? And I always have to answer that question by going back to the Greek dictionary. There, I think it helps us in dealing with this question. There are 3 words in the Greek language for love.
One is the word eros. Eros is a sort of aesthetic love. Plato used to talk about it a great deal in his dialogues, the yearning of the soul for the realm of the divine. It's come to us to be, in a sense, romantic love, and so we all know about eros. In this sense, we've experienced it and read about it in all the beauties of literature. In a sense, Edgar Allan Poe was talking about eros when he talked about his beautiful Annabel Lee, with the love surrounded by the halo of eternity. In a sense, Shakespeare was talking about eros when he said, "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. It is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark." You know, I can remember that one because I used to quote it to my wife when we were courting. That's eros.
The Greek language comes out with another word. It is the word agape. Agape is more than aesthetic or romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is creative. It is redemptive, good for all men. It is an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. Theologians would say that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. And when one rises to love on this level, he loves every man. Not because he likes that particular person, but because God loves him. And he rises to the level of loving the person who does the evil deed, while hating the deed that the person does. And I think this is what Jesus meant when he said, "Love your enemies." And I'm happy that he didn't say, "Like your enemies," because it is pretty difficult to like some people. Like is affectionate. Like is sentimental at points. And it's pretty difficult to like somebody bombing your home, or threatening your children, or seeking to destroy you. It's pretty difficult to like them, but Jesus says, love them, and love is greater than like. Love is understanding, creative goodwill for all men, and I believe firmly that it is this kind of love that will lead us on through this period of transition and make it possible for us to achieve the real society of brotherhood.
This is what we try to teach in the struggle for freedom and justice in the nonviolent movement in the South. We have come to the point where we are able to say to those who will even use violence to block us, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. We cannot, in all good conscience, obey your unjust laws, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. And so throw us in jail, and we will still love you. Bomb our homes and threaten our children, and as difficult as it is, we will still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities after midnight hours and drag us out onto some wayside road and beat us and leave us half dead, and we will still love you. Be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer, and one day we will win our freedom. We will not only win freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process.
This is our message, and this is what we are trying to get across. And this is what I believe in. I believe it will take us to a glorious new day. It will save the Negro from going into the new age bitter. It will save us from going into the new age seeking to retaliate and get even with those who have inflicted oppression and injustice upon him for years. It will save him from seeking to rise from a position of disadvantage to one of advantage, thereby subverting justice and substituting one tyranny for another. This is why I said Black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy. God is not interested merely in the freedom of Black men and brown men and any other men. God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race, in the creation of a society where all men will live together as brothers and where every man will respect the dignity and the worth of human personality. This is what we work for, and this is the good of society which we must seek in America. But it will not come until enough people are willing to stand up and mobilize forces of goodwill to seek to implement that which is just and right.